I'm Patrick. I want to talk about getting oriented with Compass. So first of all, what is Compass? It's basically a framework for authoring style sheets. It uses Haml and Sass. Well, really just Sass, but since Haml is sort of contains Sass, when you install the Compass gem, you're installing Haml to get Sass. And basically, it's very lightweight. I think when we use the word framework, it's kind of scary. It's like a real commitment. But Compass is incredibly lightweight for what it does. So why do we need to use Compass? Generally, with a sufficiently, real web app, our style sheets are too long, they're too complex, and generally just a fucking mess, right? So just this week, I was going through a client's style sheet. They might be in this room. It was like 1,800 lines long, and the computers can parse that kind of stuff, but your head can't. So basically, I'm talking to all of you because you all are making this mistake. So you might say, okay, why should I use Compass? I don't want to use Haml, I want to use ERB. That's actually fine. Compass is really just sort of a wrapper for Sass. So you can use it with either ERB or Haml. You might have seen Sass in its previous incarnations and said, okay, this is kind of weird syntax. It's not CSS. It's annoying to go back and forth. That's been fixed. So the newest version of Sass is essentially a superset of CSS. You might say, okay, well, I only craft everything by hand. I would never use a framework to do that. And I would say, as someone who loves to handcraft HTML and CSS, this will make you more productive. And you might say, well, my app's not very complicated. I don't have any styles yet. And that's a good time to start using a framework and thinking about building your own internal framework that really speaks to the objects in the application you're building. So it's always a great time to think about that. So essentially, your argument's invalid. You should definitely use Compass and Sass, and personally, I think you should use Haml as well, because I say so. So how do you get started? Gem Compass, bundle install Compass. Just run Compass version from the command line to make sure you got it installed. Then you want to, particularly for Rails, do Compass init Rails, and then the path to your app. So if you're in your local app directory, there's a big dot there, right? It will create a compass.rb file in your config directory. You may want to look at that and tweak it depending on what you want to do. And I think the default Compass configuration will add a directory called stylesheets to your main app directory within your Rails application structure. So what are the basics of Compass? Let's start with SCSS files. SCSS is really just sassy CSS. And basically, the way that Compass works and Sass works is we have an SCSS file where we're primarily writing our styles, and that gets compiled down to a CSS file. That's totally normal. It's just the SCSS stuff is doing some magic. So here's an example, right? We've got app style sheets, just app.scss. So you can see we're defining some styles for body, for H1s, and with links within H1s, and then down at the bottom there, links and also the hover state for links. So that basically looks like CSS, but there are a couple things that you don't normally see in CSS, which primarily is just the nesting. So when we look at that link inside the H1, it's nested. So what we're really saying is, when we spit this out as CSS, we want to say, H1A. So we're sort of using descendant selectors here. So just to compare that, go back, right? So SCSS, CSS. So pretty straightforward. But as you can imagine, if you have really complicated nesting, that's a real pain in the ass to write out by hand normally. So just that alone saves you a lot of time. So you've got variables. I haven't even really bothered using these too much. But a great example is colors. So you have common colors you use across your site. So why not use those as variables? So you can see here, we're defining a blue variable at the top there, and also a margin. And then we're using those variables later on in different style declarations. And so we take that and we render this to CSS, and this is what we get. So pretty straightforward. You can see too that it's actually doing some math there. So it's dividing the 16 pixel margin variable by 2 to get 8 pixels, which is pretty cool. So you've also got partials. So partials basically are just a way to make your style sheets more modular. And instead of having one giant file, you can have a lot of different files that are a little more appropriate to whatever you're styling. So as a very simple example of this, I just have a single style sheet, and I want to import some core styles for type, right? So I've added a style sheet in the core directory, which is just core/type.scss, which is I've got some styles for my headlines. So then when we render this entire thing out, if we go back to the beginning, we're including the type there. Here it is, and then we're combining the two, right? So you can see just with that very simple building block, you can build some pretty cool stuff. So the real power of Compass and Sass is mixins. So a mixin is basically a set of styles that you can easily apply to a lot of different declarations very easily. So in this case, what we're doing is we're defining what we want large text to be. It's not the most semantic class name or mixin name, but this is just a dumb example. So we're saying, large text is Arial, it's 20 pix in size, it's bold, and I think it's red or something. So that's our mixin that we define right there. Pretty straightforward. So let's say we had our page title class. We could very easily include that mixin as large text. And then we render this out to CSS, we get that. So pretty straightforward. I think you all know what was going on there. So Compass, basically, the real heart of it is it's kind of like mixins on steroids, or Charlie Sheen, however you want to kind of discuss it. So Compass has mixins for all the new CSS3 stuff. So in Scott's talk, he was talking about using rounded corners. You've got to declare a bunch of things to do that. And so if you're adding rounded corners all over your entire app, that's a pain in the ass. So Compass has a mixin just for doing that, where you just say rounded corners, 6 pixels, and it does everything else for you. So it's got that. It's got a lot of great built-in mixins for layouts and grids like Blueprint and Yahoo UI and other grid systems like 960, fancy buttons, etc. Really, to me, this is sort of a great unexplored territory. People have made a lot of really cool mixins. You can make your own and share them and so on. So as a simple example, I've got some SCSS here where I want to basically have rounded corners on all of my input fields, like the text fields, the password fields, and the text area boxes. So all we do is just say include border radius 6 pixel, and that'll do what you think it does when it's all rendered out. So given these building blocks, how do you organize your style sheets? Here's a model I've been using a lot lately. It's a little bit different from what Compass does by default, but basically you can see there a really clean and organized and sort of sane style sheets directory, right? And so everything basically is driving off app.scss. If you look inside of that, it's basically including all the other files in the style sheets directory. So up top we have 3 different mixins for Compass stuff. So it's including a reset and a couple other core Compass things. And then the next set of stuff is for external libraries. Sometimes you have, jQuery plugins or other things you're using that already have their own styles. So you can kind of import those into your stack. And then below that, I've defined a bunch of core styles for this particular site. So styles for color, styles for default tags, styles for layout, styles for forms, etc. And so you define all that. And then at the bottom there, anything that's really specific to a particular model or controller, I'm kind of calling feature, or you could call it custom, or whatever. But the whole idea is with the core stuff, make your own little mini framework for how you want to style, all the stuff that's part of your site, and then just override that occasionally when you need to do specific layouts for different controllers or actions. So in closing, some resources. This is the main Compass website. You can just Google Compass CSS, you'll find it. They've got some great references on there to get started, and it's also on GitHub on Chris Epstein's account. So there you go, Compass. Any questions?
Actually, I have the mic, so I'll ask the first one. How do you compile? You were saying that you need to compile from SCSS to CSS.
Sure. So
compile.
For the Rails app, that's kind of handled automatically. You don't have to really worry about it. So it will take stuff from app style sheets and compile it down to public style sheets, and you're good to go.
In development mode, every time you modify the file, it gets recompiled?
Correct, yeah. So it'll do that. It can be a little bit trickier to get it working in MERB. I'm sure you can also use it with Sinatra or Padrino or something. And then I know some people here, myself included, use Heroku. One trick with Heroku is you can't really have assets in your Heroku slug for your app. So you kind of have two choices. You can just precompile the style sheets locally and check them in, or have it as part of your normal push process. Or as Heroku is now recommending in the most recent blog post, there's like a rack adapter basically where you can intercept things and save the style sheets in your temp directory every time you redeploy the app. So.
The other question is, how do you debug your CSS? So I guess, when everything is compiled and you go into the web page and you find a bug, how do you find where it is in the Sassy CSS?
Yeah, so a couple things. One thing that's really nice about Compass is that it actually will tell you when things are not right to begin with. So you'll really get an error the same way you would get an error if you screwed up something in your model or controller. But in addition to that, you can, I think by default, have line comments enabled. So every single style that's generated will have a reference back to whichever parent SCSS file generated it. Yeah, exactly.
What's the advantage of the modules over just having a strong set of core CSS classes?
Do you mean the Compass stuff?
Well, you were talking about building out your core modules and then including them in all sorts of things. And when I've tried to do that type of behavior before, it's usually just I have a set of core classes that your large text or whatever, and then those classes can be wherever I need them to be.
Yeah, I mean, you certainly could take what I've done and do the same thing. It's just what I found was a great way to do it was to really break things out into separate style sheets so that your form stuff was just in form.scss, right? So I really haven't. I think because of the core Compass mixins are so powerful, I haven't really needed to develop too many of my own mixins so far. So really, all I'm doing is just breaking up the style sheets just for sanity's sake, and they're all being, when they're compiled, they're just compiled into one single style sheet in the order in which I've defined all of those includes. But you certainly could do it that way or do it a hybrid way with the approach you described. It really just depends on the app and what you want to do in person. But I like this particular structure.
The last question on this one, so we keep it rolling.
Yeah.
This looks a lot like less CSS. Have you used less, and can you compare the two at all?
I probably couldn't give you a good comparison. I mean, I think they are pretty similar. So it's really almost like which community did they come out of, and sometimes I think you see less being used more in the PHP world necessarily than this, but.
It looks like there's at least tighter integration with the Rails with
Compass.
With Compass, yeah.
Yeah, and I think the mixins are pretty well developed too. But
you can't have a parameterized mixin where you can define methods. It's almost like in Compass, it's almost like defining a method. And you can pass in parameters. So the way I use it to answer kind of the guy's question in the back too, if you want to write little reusable components, it's much more reusable than less. It lets you actually write a little method. So let's say you have a drop shadow you want to show, but you want to show it in a different color. So you can write this, kind of reusable Compass mixin and pass stuff into it. So it's really cool. Okay. Yeah, it might be recent, exactly.
Yeah, I do think they're pretty close. Just whichever syntax you prefer. I mean, if you're using one of them, I think you're winning. So. All right. Well, I guess one more question, and then we'll. Yeah. It's
I just wanted to clarify that most of what you showed here is not Compass specific. It was almost all Sass.
Correct.
And what Compass is essentially just a bunch of macros for Sass.
Yeah, essentially, I think it makes it easier to kind of get going with Sass, and then there's a lot of developed mix-ins, which, just given the length of this talk, I didn't have a chance to go into that, super in depth. But, what's nice about it is, say, you could use the Blueprint mix-in, and that would give you a lot of really awesome default styles, from the get-go. So, all right, thanks.